Okay, hello everyone. All right, so let's talk more about variable declaration and variable scope. All right, so we've talked a little bit about methods. We talked about methods being one or more lines of Java code wrapped up together with curly braces and given a name. So the people who developed the Java language have written code, okay, one or more lines of code, and then they've wrapped them up with curly braces, and then they've given it a name. And anytime we use that name, the actual term for it is anytime we call that name, those series of lines of code get executed. Now, the reason why they did that is just for us to not write them again or to use them in our programs. We'll talk more about methods, but I've been kind of introducing it gradually and talking about it briefly this way. So one of the methods that the people who developed the Java language have created is called main. And anytime we use that method name, the actual term for it is anytime we call it. So anytime we call it, the series of lines of code that you wrote for the main method, right, it gets executed. That's the idea of methods. Do not worry about these keywords. Okay, we'll talk more about them when we are dealing with methods, when we're talking about methods. But you should, kind of have a rough, idea. If you don't have an idea about it, don't worry. So the actual point of this video is to talk about variable declaration and variable scope. So a local variable, okay, is any variable that is declared in this method, in the method. Well, not just this particular method, but a local variable is a variable that is declared in a method. And this is one method. This is called the main method. It starts here. That's the opening curly brace, and this is the closing curly brace. So any variable that goes in here is going to be a local variable. And you can declare variables anywhere in this local variable, right? But then where you declare the variable in here also determines the scope, or basically where that variable can be accessed. So in order to, let me kind of demonstrate it so you can see. So I'm going to create, let's create an int variable, and I'm going to call it number1. And I'm going to store the number 2 in there, and I'm going to terminate this. I'm going to write a system.out.print statement to print out the value of number1. Oops. Let's just print out the value of number1. So when I compile this and I run, I'm expecting to see whatever is stored in number1 here, which is 2. So we can see 2 over here. 2 over here. I'm going to make a copy of these 2 lines, and then basically create another variable. I'm going to call it number2, and I'm going to store the value, let's say 100 in there. And I'm going to print out what's stored in number2. Right? So compile it. So when I run this program, I'm expecting to see what's stored in number1 here, which is 2, and what's stored in number2 here, which is 100. So when I run this, I see 2 and 100. So I talked about the fact that you can declare variables anywhere in the method, right? Anywhere in the method, right? But where you declare them also determines the scope, I mean, where it can be accessed. You have to, first of all, create the variable before you can use it. So over here, if I try to print out number2, it's going to be a problem, right? Because first of all, number2 hasn't been declared. I'm using a variable called number2 when it hasn't been declared. Number2 is declared after this line here. It's declared over here, but on this line, we know that Java code, okay, it gets executed from top to bottom, right? So it gets to this line, it declares number1, right? It declares number1, all right, but we are telling, in this line, we are telling the program to print out what's stored in number2. At this point, it doesn't know what number2 is yet. It's not until this point here. It's not until number 8 here till we see number2 getting declared. Number2 only gets declared. Number2 gets alive on this line here. So we cannot refer to it. We can't use it. It's just like, think of it as giving birth to a baby before you can. Well, think about it as wanting to have access to your baby when you haven't given birth to it, wanting to hold your baby in your arms when you haven't given birth to it. Over here, we are trying to access this number when we haven't even created it or declared it, right? So when I compile this and I run, well, I can't even run. When I compile this, it's telling me it cannot find the symbol, and that symbol is a variable which is called number2, right? Because number2 hasn't been declared. So this variable, even though it's within these curly braces and it's basically a local variable, right? It's in the scope of this method. It's actually out of scope because it's actually out of in terms of this variable trying to print out number2. It's actually out of scope a little bit, right? in order to bring it in scope, it has to be before we try to print it out, before we try to use it, right? So it's worth in understanding this, so that when you're writing your code, you have problems like these, you kind of understand that you need to create the variables before you try to access them, right? So anytime so now let me just fix this. When I compile this, it can't find number 2, the variable number 2. That's because it's not declared. So let me just change this back to number 1, because number 1 is declared here, so it can find it. Number 2 is declared here, and then I'm trying to print out number 2 here so it can find it. So anytime it gets here, number 1 has come in scope. So now anything after it can access it, right? All the way to the end of this line, this method here. This is the last curly brace all the way to here. So from line 10 all the way to line 5, the number 1 variable is active, right? Number 1 variable is active all the way down to the end of the method. The number 2 variable is active all the way from line 8 only to 10. So that's kind of the scope of this. I can't access number 2, I can't access number 2 before this. Okay, I can't access it. If I try to access it, try to print it out or use it in a programming statement, it's not going to work, right? It will only work from this line going down all the way to the end of the method. Okay, if I go outside the method, we are out of scope. But we will talk about it. We will talk more about it. So again, you can declare local variables in a method, and okay, the scope of the variables will be in that particular method, but also in the method itself, where you declare the variable and use them. Okay, is very important. Okay, the variable can be in scope. The variable can come in scope or be out of scope, depending on what line you declare it and what line you try to access it from. So this is just for you to have an idea of a little bit more on variable declaration and variable scope, and it will make more sense as we write programs. It will be clearer, and knowing this or having this in the back of your mind, when you encounter problems like these, you can solve them. Okay, so if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll do everything to respond to them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time with the next video. All right then, bye bye.